Thank you so much. I'm Coral Davenport. I cover energy and environment policy for the New York Times. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to hear from some of Washington's most impressive women leaders. These are women who live in both the policy and think tank worlds, who are focused not only on today, but on tomorrow's global challenges, on new ideas, new ways of doing things, and considering our world for this discussion of 20 ideas to meet tomorrow's global challenges. I don't know if we'll get to 20, maybe we'll get to more. We'll see what happens. Our panelists are Bathsheba Crocker, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, Kristen Lord, President and CEO of IREX, and Sherry Bryan, Vice President of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. Their full bios appear in your program book. Once we get started on the panel, please use your index cards to send any questions up to the panel via the volunteers. Since I work on issues of energy and environment policy, and especially on climate change policy, I thought I would kick off the panel with a few thoughts on that. Climate change will be one of the defining issues of the 21st century. The problem of climate change will affect where and how people live, what they fight over, the cost and availability of food, water, and energy, and the future of public health. The International Organization for Migration has estimated that rising sea levels, stronger storms, and food shortages caused by climate change could trigger a wave of up to 1 billion new refugees by 2050. A report by the CNA Corporation Military Advisory Board concluded that climate change-induced drought in the Middle East and Africa is already a driving conflict over food and water and escalating longstanding regional and ethnic tensions into violent clashes. A growing number of economic studies have concluded that unchecked climate change is already acting as a check on global GDP. Climate change is a problem unlike any that our political systems have ever faced. And the only way to solve it, like it or not, is with coordinated action by multiple governments, which need to be willing to fundamentally reshape their economies, raise their energy costs, put some industries out of business in order to stave off future disasters. That push to find that solution, that global solution to climate change, will reshape the global economy as we know it. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, global economic growth has been fueled by the consumption of fossil fuel energy sources, oil, coal, and natural gas. The growth in global economy has directly tracked the growth in fossil fuel emissions. A number of voices in the climate debate have said that the only way to stop climate change is to stop economic growth. That's effectively the message of Naomi Klein's new book on climate change, and it's also the leading argument by politicians who oppose climate change policy. They argue that pricing or regulating fossil fuel emissions isn't worth it because it hurts economic growth. I tend to think that both of those views are wrong. I think that the big question on energy and climate for the 21st century is, how do you continue that economic growth but decouple it from the growth in fossil fuel emissions? Earlier this year, a report by the International Energy Agency found that that might at least be possible. For the first time on record, 2014 was the first year that global GDP grew while emissions leveled off. That was the very first sign of this decoupling. That happened for a mix of reasons. There has been a surge in the use of renewable energy and a big improvement in energy efficiency, the technology that squeezes out more economic activity out of less energy. That moment of decoupling, that first sign, doesn't mean that we can solve climate change, but I do think it signals that the possibility is there. It opens the door to figuring out how do we make that decoupling continue? How do we fundamentally change the energy systems from the 20th century to the 21st century? Again, the possibility and the opportunity are there. And with that, I'd like to turn to the panelists and have them each sort of set us off with an idea, and then we'll jump into a conversation.
Okay, thanks, Coral.
Sheba, if you would start us off.
All right.
Oh, sure. Once again, it's Sheba Crocker, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, Kristen Lord, President and CEO of IREX, and Sherry Bryan, Vice President for the National Democratic Institute of International Affairs.
Okay, thanks so much, and thanks very much to the Women's Foreign Policy Group for having me here on the occasion of your 20th anniversary. It's very exciting, and I look forward very much to today's discussion. I am here, not surprisingly, as the Assistant Secretary for International Organizations to talk a bit about the role of the United Nations in addressing today's challenges. We are in the 70th anniversary year, actually, of the United Nations, so I can't really call it a new idea, but it has changed a lot, and I think one big question to grapple with is whether it is, in fact, up to the jobs of today, both the old familiar challenges that we have faced for decades and some of the new and metastasizing ones. The UN undeniably possesses indispensable capabilities and capacities, and perhaps most importantly, I think it brings a global response and a moral authority that is unmatched and in many ways is still very much needed as we look to today's challenges. So the question isn't so much about whether we need the system or whether we need a fully new system, but I think whether the system is performing as we need it to, and whether we can find the political will that is needed sometimes both at home and in conversations with our partners and other UN member states to make the changes that may be needed to the system to actually make it most effective in addressing today's challenges. Today's crises pose challenges that can seem sometimes dizzying in both their breadth and their complexity, and I think if we look at, for example, the humanitarian response in Syria and the surrounding countries, that becomes quite clear. It is requiring a regional humanitarian response on an unprecedented level and management of a huge response in the face of continued political intransigence to deal with the underlying conflict. And then when you add into that response to the conflict in Iraq, post-earthquake Nepal, the situation in South Sudan, the need for appropriate political responses throughout the Middle East, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It really can seem quite daunting. And even when the system seems not fully up to the task, I think really we have to ask the question of consider the architectural vacuum that the UN would leave behind if it closed shop tomorrow in dealing with these peace and security issues, global health, human rights, development, gender, environment, climate change, aviation, and again, the list just goes on and on. We're, of course, also facing new and in some cases more aggravated challenges on climate change, on food security, on concurrent humanitarian crises, a revanchist Russia, an expansionist China, violent extremism, persistent civil conflict, and again, the list just goes on. And to a remarkable degree, I think we are seeing today a real level of energy, and in some cases renewed energy, across the international system that reveals a renewed sense of global determination. And there are a number of things that one could put on this list. First is the considerable determination that exists to reach a real climate change agreement this year at the end of the year in Paris. The unprecedented scope of UN peacekeeping activities with 16 peacekeeping missions and over 130 personnel serving in peacekeeping missions around the world, and a real effort this year to address the needed issues around peacekeeping reform. UN humanitarian agencies stretching and in some cases innovating to address 5 concurrent so-called level 3 emergencies, which they have never faced that many at the same time. We have Syria, Iraq, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and the post-Ebola response. A UN Security Council that is busier with more on its agenda than at any time in history. Global interest, urgency, and engagement on the successor to the Millennium Development Goals, the so-called post-2015 process. Invigorated use of special mandates by the Human Rights Council, continuing normative evolution at the Human Rights Council to address issues like LGBTI and gender and other issues, internet freedom, ambition and risk-taking by all parties associated with the Iran negotiations, including the responsibilities that will entail for the International Atomic Energy Agency should we reach an agreement. The crucial role that special political missions are playing, especially across Africa and in the Middle East, and in many cases in the Middle East, if you look at Libya, Yemen, and Syria as an example, the UN missions are the international community's only real remaining eyes and ears on the ground. You have organizations like UNICEF, which are innovating and applying market analysis and economies of scale to drive down cost and increase provision of crucial services such as vaccines around the world. And the UN assuming a greater role, or attempting to assume a greater role, in efforts to counter violent extremism and foreign terrorist fighters, for example. When the UN was founded 70 years ago this month, there were 50 founding nations who gathered in San Francisco in 1945. And when they did, it was to adopt the big new idea of that time, a body with the convening authority and the international legal legitimacy to prevent war between the great powers. And though through the intervening 7 decades, very little has remained as it was at that moment, it is undeniable that the UN has in fact met that fundamental objective. That big idea, of course, has evolved over time, and I think we're past the point where we could talk about one big idea of our time. The international system of today comprises 193 member states and dozens of organizations and agencies. In fact, I think I discover a new one pretty much every week. Civil society networks such as the Women's Foreign Policy Groups have emerged as powerful complement to multilateral tools. And globalization has fostered economic and cultural linkages that would have been unimaginable at the end of World War II. The United States, of course, is featured prominently in all of this. And while the administrations over time have used multilateral tools somewhat differently and to differing scopes and scales, US leadership at the UN has generally been robust. That leadership has, of course, taken many forms over time, from shaping the UN's original outlines during the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944, to promoting the development of the Security Council as a robust instrument of peace and security, to driving reforms that resulted in the creation of the Human Rights Council, a body that this administration ultimately decided to join, to continuing to be to bear by far the largest financial burden of supporting the UN system as the United States. And I think that leadership remains robust because despite misgivings that continue to exist, as we are all aware, about the UN's failings and inefficiencies, some of which we share at times, it and the rest of the international system still remain crucial to how the United States advances our key interests. And in fact, I think if you looked across the board now at all of the significant foreign policy challenges and priorities that the United States is facing and attempting to address, it's hard to imagine one that doesn't involve the UN or the UN system in some way. So in that context, and in the context of our panel theme, I thought I would offer a few questions to provoke thoughts, because of course, coming from inside the government, we don't always have all the time we would like to come up with all the bright new ideas. But here are a few questions. First of all, I think it's important for us to understand whether the UN and its member states can adequately tackle issues like counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. It is a system that was founded on the idea of state sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that it's very much premised on the notion of state responsibility. Yet we are facing more and more issues and transnational challenges, whether it be climate change or foreign terrorist fighters or violent extremism, that cross borders and that don't necessarily fit neatly in that package. Should the United States, in this time of so many concurrent humanitarian crises, be taking a more fundamental look at the humanitarian system that was set up over the decades, and whether that needs some serious reform? We have continued primacy by the UN Security Council on peace and security issues, but as we have seen very directly in recent years, it doesn't always perform as it should. And it has had, obviously, in its most heightened form, a sort of inability to really deal with the issues of Syria and Ukraine. And frankly, is the system still up for delivering, still able to deliver on what we're calling the big ticket items that it has delivered on in the past, major framework agreements on big global challenges? And this year, the UN is attempting to do that on a number of different fronts: on financing for development, on disaster risk reduction, on the post-2015 effort, on peacekeeping reform, on countering violent extremism, on renegotiating the UN budget, on internet governance, and of course on climate change. And I think we will see in the unfolding months whether both the member states have the political will to really come to real and meaningful agreements on any of these issues, and whether the UN can deliver in the way that it historically has been able to in trying to tackle some of these challenges.
Thanks so much. Kristen?
Thank you, Pearl. I too, is my mic on? There it is. I too want to start by congratulating the Women's Foreign Policy Group on 20 years of great work and on a really impressive lineup. You know, there's been a lot of talk, even consternation over the last year about why there aren't more senior women on foreign policy and national security conference panels. And when I looked at the agenda for today, I thought not only, wow, they made that look effortless, but also, wow, I can think of 100 people who could just have easily filled the positions on the panel. And then I thought, what's the problem here? So I just want to congratulate you for your effortless approach to finding senior women to put on foreign policy panels. What I chose to focus on today was youth. And I know the major number here is 20. The magic number is 20, but I chose a different number. It's 1.2 billion. And the reason I chose 1.2 billion is because that's the number of young people aged 15 to 24 in the world today. This is the largest generation of youth in human history. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. We now have the largest generation of youth in human history right now. 87% of these youth live in developing countries, and they make up 40% of the world's unemployed. Now, of course, this isn't a universal phenomenon. It's not a global phenomenon. Countries like Japan, countries in Europe, Russia are actually struggling with aging populations. But in South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, there are huge, huge youth populations. Now, normally this is called a bulge, the youth bulge. And I don't think I have to tell an audience full of women that bulge has a negative connotation. We could think about this in a different way, but normally it is very much cast as a threat. And I'm someone who has a somewhat odd career moving between education and human development and public diplomacy on the one side, and then hard power, national security, war and conflict on the other. To me, these are very much entwined, but one thing that's been constant is I've heard again and again in speeches and read in journal articles and others about this threat of the global youth bulge because it's associated with social marginalization, political violence, terrorism, criminality, and just general instability. So, but is this really just a threat? In some ways, yes, clearly. But of course, it's also an opportunity. And what we do now and the way we engage these young people, these youth around the world, is going to have a profound effect on what these regions look like for the next couple of generations at least. So my question is, are we really thinking through what the future is for this population of youth, and what are we going to do to make sure that it's a youth boom and not the youth bulge or the youth threat that so many like to talk about? And so I have another confession to make to you, which is the last few years I have been focused more on national security and conflict. I came back to more of the world of international development, and I was expecting there to be a lot of attention and money focused on youth because there's been so much rhetoric. Well, I'm here to tell you that apparently it's not true. It turns out that most of the money, and again, it's not money by itself, the money is a symptom of the attention. But the money actually goes to much younger children for a variety of reasons we can talk about in the questions and answer period. Their problems are less complex. It's easier to quantify and measure and show politicians results. They're much more adorable than older people. They don't have sort of difficult problems involving substance abuse and crime and pregnancy and all these kinds of things. But just to give you one example, donors spend 4 times more, these are global development donors, spend 4 times more on primary education than they do on later years of schooling, despite the fact that primary education is actually much less expensive on a per capita basis than the higher levels of education. And that's just one example, but the list goes on and on. The spending really goes off a cliff when children get older. It's a bit hard to track because the numbers are not good here. But this is all despite the fact that the challenges that youth have and whether they go on a positive path or a negative path actually has profound implications for how societies evolve, their economic growth, their political stability, their security. So it's just a big puzzle to me why this is the case. So what should we do about this? One is, let's focus on it. There's really very little attention to it, and there are youth coordinator positions in some of our government agencies. These have been unfilled often. I think 2 of them are unfilled right now. They don't have any budgets. And it's symptomatic, again, of the fact that there's not really high-level attention or commitment to having a strategy to positively engage youth. Another thing is there's not a lot of extra money out there, but let's focus on how the investments we're already making in justice, governance, civil society, women's empowerment, the list goes on. How are we incorporating a youth focus or youth inclusion into dealing with these issues? Where's that? That's something we can do with existing resources. Another is to really focus on investing in education and workforce development, leadership development. At IREX, we're really proud. This is a major focus of what we do. We run a lot of the US government's exchange programs, the Young African Leaders Initiative, Mandela Fellows Program. I think these are programs that really have strong bipartisan support because people do feel that over time they pay off. The problem is there is a numbers problem. Even relatively large programs like the Young African Leaders Initiative, which brings 500 rising leaders from Africa, this is a drop in the bucket, and so we need to not only focus on these programs, but also expand the pie, if you will. And there are lower cost methods to do this, including online methods. There's a growing population of people using online courses and training materials around the world, and we can tap this. This is something else IREX is working on. Finally, we can just stop talking about youth as always being a problem or a bulge. That's bad, we all agree, right? And we can really start instead focusing on a boom. So let's change our rhetoric a little bit and focus on youth as a positive force. So, thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I also want to thank the Women's Foreign Policy Group for inviting me to be up here with such an esteemed panel. And thank all of you for hanging in here for this last panel of the day, because I know it's been a long day and it's been a fascinating set of discussions. I want to talk, I work at NDI, the National Democratic Institute. We work in 65 countries around the world trying to help improve democratic systems, institutions, and supporting Democrats. I want to talk about 3 big issues that we see happening right now that I think are changing democracy, perhaps, and changing the way that politics are done in the developing world and the developed world. The first issue is that of urbanization. So right now, for the first time in history, more than half of the world's population live in urban cities, in large cities. There's 3.7 billion people in the world right now, and that will double by 2050. So for many of you who are young, you're going to see a huge transformation in the number of people that live in this world. What's very compelling about the urban power and growth is that 50% of the world live in cities, but more than 80% of the world's GDP is generated from cities. And so as more people move into urban areas, that percentage of GDP is just going to grow. And what that means is that there are tremendous economic opportunities for people in urban areas. And while our organization focuses on the developing world and many people who are at the poverty level, we do see, based on data, that more and more poor people have better opportunities when they move to cities. There are tremendous challenges as well, but there are more opportunities for jobs, for healthcare, to have their kids in school, and this is particularly true for women. Women have greater opportunities to lift themselves and their families out of poverty by moving into a big city than they do by staying in a rural area. Now, there are some significant drawbacks as well, but economically, women are going to do better when they move into big cities. Another interesting thing that's happening in megacities and urban areas is that they're beginning to have their own foreign policy agendas and their own foreign policy networks. And so up until now, we've looked at national government to national government relationships, and that's beginning to change in cities that have populations of 15 and 20 million people. So the city of Shanghai has its own foreign affairs office. So does the city of Sao Paulo, and on and on. Cities are beginning to enter into trade agreements and other types of agreements with other cities and not waiting for their national governments to take this on. So it's sort of interesting to think about the politics of that. What does that really mean that the mayor of Shanghai or the mayor of Sao Paulo may be doing things outside of the national government? And in some countries, the mayor may have more political power, may represent more citizens in a way than does the president or the national government. I think the other interesting thing that's going on and that I've seen a little bit of is the innovation that's happening in urban areas. I was just in Mumbai last month, and it's a city of almost 12 million people. The local government there is doing so many remarkable things to engage citizens in ordinary, everyday issues regarding transportation, the budget process, what they're going to do with the big slum area in Mumbai. And they're using technology to do this. And there are NGOs in Mumbai, probably a half a dozen NGOs that we met with over a 2-day period. There were more that we didn't have time to meet with, who are actually using technology, bringing citizens in, getting citizens' input. And I thought, this is something that's not even happening in Washington, D.C. I've never seen anything like it. And this is a mega city. So it's quite outstanding. And to think about the impact of all the people coming in, the impact on women and children, I think the challenges are what we think of in big cities, you know, access to clean water, good education, healthcare. It's going to require, you know, tremendous leaders to take on the leadership roles in these cities, and that's going to also impact politics. We're going to look for people who can manage the majority of the country's population when we're electing a mayor in the future. The second thing I wanted to talk about was technology, and this sort of feeds off the panel that we heard earlier today, and a question about whether technology is actually improving democracy. And there was an article written last week, or that came out last week in Foreign Policy by Tom Carruthers, who's at Carnegie. And he asked the question, you know, why everybody thinks technology is so great, but why is democracy failing? And he asked the opinions of 6 preeminent kind of democracy political thinkers to weigh in on this. And they ended up kind of giving a relatively negative view of the impact of technology on democracy, because they focused on many of the authoritarian countries around the world, the Russias and China and Iran, who are really using technology to oppress and repress citizens. And that's tragic, and that's something that we all, the internet, the UN and international actors, have to continue to try to deal with. But I think there's tremendous positive aspects of technology in the way that we're engaging in politics. That includes, first of all, there's more information. There's simply more data available around the world. It's sort of incomprehensible. 15 years ago, we could not have imagined that we could access the kind of information and data about what our governments are doing in the fashion that we can today. It's going to be, the next leap will be how we take that data and actually use it as ordinary citizens. But the fact that it's available is quite remarkable. And there are initiatives around the world, the Open Government Partnership, the Open Parliament Organization, that are trying to bring civil society and governments together to talk about opening more information to its citizens. The other thing that I think is changing is what I was referring to in Mumbai, that at least at the local level, services are improving in a way by using technology. So there's all sorts of interesting things happening around the world, from an easy way to report on potholes and get them fixed and to track your claim with the Department of Transportation, to being involved in the budget process of your city, the services on banking, the Maasai warrior who's herding his cattle in Tanzania can do his online banking on his phone. There are so many examples that we've heard all about. But simple things are becoming easier, and that extends to the political arena. So we can reach out and contact our political leaders in a way that 15 years ago we simply couldn't do. We would have to write a letter, put it in the mail, wait for a form letter to come back, or we would have to actually go visit, try to get an appointment to visit somebody at the local level or at the national level. Today, we can tweet, we can Facebook, we can email, and if any of you work with politicians around the world, I can tell you, they all care about this and they all track it. And our congressional offices have people that do nothing but track Twitter feeds, Facebook requests, in any type of social media. So it's a two-way street. Also, politicians are using social media to engage with us directly. That's transformative. Now, it may not be improving yet the quality of the politicians we have, but it's certainly changing the way that we engage in politics. I think the last thing, and this was touched on in earlier panels, is we can organize ourselves in different ways than we could before. So the revolutions from the Arab Spring to the protest in Turkey and Brazil over the last several years, social media and technology have been able to capture people's attention, bring them together, and their voices together in a way that was sort of unheard of in the, before the last 15 or 20 years. I think the challenges are that the technology in itself is not the answer, and it is not the lasting solution. The protesters that come to Tahrir Square have to transform their issues into a social movement that will be impactful and lasting, and that didn't happen in Egypt, and it hasn't happened in other places. And we've got to figure out how to unleash the power of technology from repressive governments that we talked about earlier. But all in all, I would give on a scorecard of whether technology is improving democracy and politics, I would say absolutely yes. The third thing I'd like to talk about is women in politics and the power of change that they can bring if we can just get more women elected around the world. And I think most of us in the room know intuitively that if more women were in decision-making positions, things would be differently. But now, for the first time, slowly, data is coming together that shows that there actually is a measurable impact in policies and politics when a certain number of women get into decision-making positions at the national level. And the things that they focus on are no surprise to all of us in this room. They focus on education, they focus on health care, they focus on priorities for women and children and for societies. The challenge continues to be that there is still only an average of 22% of women in legislatures. This is the most common way to measure this, in national legislatures or parliaments around the world. And the tipping point is really around 35%. So we've got to continue to strive, not only here in the United States, but around the world to try to encourage more women to get into politics. And there are a lot of barriers that we have to break down before that can happen. But we know, I think we're beginning to know, and there's more and more data to show that if they can get there, and it doesn't have to be equity, it doesn't have to be 50%, we could reach for 35%, and policies will change, economies will improve, and more women and children will be lifted out of poverty. So urbanization, technology, and women, I think, are three things that we need to look out for in the future, and I think they're changing both the landscape of politics and hopefully improving democracy in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. We have great questions from the audience. First one goes to Sheba. How do we reinforce and renew faith in international institutions when international norms seem to be flouted more than ever, and by major powers, for example, Putin's march into Crimea and the tepid reaction of the community, including not even having a Security Council debate?
So it is a great question, and I think it's one of the challenges that we face because while we see a lot of high-profile cases like Ukraine and like Syria, where in those two cases the Security Council has not always been able to reach the agreement that it needs to actually take action on some of these issues. At the same time, we see the Security Council continuing to function in a lot of other parts, in making decisions in a lot of other places in the world that are very important, both to the United States and more broadly to the global community. For example, making decisions around special political missions or peacekeeping missions being deployed to address crises and conflict in Africa. We have seen the Security Council even able to take some decisions around the conflict in Syria, although not the fundamental ones. And what I think we sometimes lose sight of is the fact that we have these high-profile cases that look like failings of the system, and that frankly are in some ways failings of the system. But if you look at the Security Council and far more broadly beyond that, we also have a lot of good news stories to tell and a lot of examples of both the maintenance of international norms, but then also the promotion of new norms as we look at, for example, the human rights issues of the day, again, gender and LGBT and internet governance being three, and the actions that the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly in New York have taken on some of those questions. But it also points out that we, in some ways we have the system that we have, and we have the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. They were the so-called great powers at the end of World War II. The landscape of the world has changed. The landscape of the Security Council has not changed so much. And we are not always going to agree on everything. And when you don't have the agreement among the permanent 5 members on some of these big ticket items on peace and security, you're not going to be able to get action in the Security Council, and that is highly frustrating. I think it also points out some opportunities and challenges more broadly than just looking at the UN system, and that is the question of when regional groups can come in to take action, and we've seen some of this by the African Union, for example, across Africa. We've seen some increased interest on the part of some of the regional organizations in the Middle East to start tackling some of the problems there. We've obviously seen over the years a lot of action by NATO when the UN Security Council was not able to come to decision. It's not a perfect answer, but I think we have to understand that there are all kinds of things that go on in the international system every single day that we don't necessarily have visibility into more broadly, but that really do help underpin global peace and security. And one esoteric one that I like to sometimes talk about is the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal. It's one of the oldest international organizations. I think it's hard to argue with the need for an international organization to set safety and security standards for international airline travel. It exists. It has been able to act on some of these recent high-profile airline disasters that we've seen, including the shoot down of MH17 over Ukraine. And there are many more examples like that where the international system still does continue to function, despite the fact that we sometimes have very deep divides among member states in New York, both on the Security Council and in the UN General Assembly.
Sherry, a follow-up for you on that. We have these international institutions, but you talked about the rise of cities and cities that are, forging compacts with each other. And, when we have a moment where it becomes, in some cases, very difficult for these international organizations to come to agreement, when the Security Council can't always come to agreement, is there a greater role? Talk about the role for cities, for non-state actors. Can they play a role in these kinds of conflicts?
Well, I'm not sure if they can play a role in some of these larger conflicts, but I think we have to not fear this sort of devolution of power. And I think in some ways it's very good for society to think that local government is actually, they're the first line of defense in touching voters and citizens. And to have some of the answers that we need to deal with in the 21st century, I think empowering local governments to do that is a good thing. These mega cities and their power, and particularly economic power, I think is a new paradigm for the world, and I think it's really going to challenge some of the basic assumptions we have about state authority. Ivo Dodler wrote an article, I think last week or week before last, maybe in the Financial Times, about megacities becoming the next non-state actor. It's a different way to think about non-state actors. But I do think it's just a new paradigm, and it's something we're going to have to deal with. And it'll be interesting, I guess, to see if the city of Mumbai can play a role in solving certain sort of global problems. I think that the conflicts is probably not going to be an area where the cities will be involved in, but certainly on the economic realm, their voices will be much more valuable and important.
Actually, I wonder specifically about the role of cities and these regional organizations in climate change, because we are seeing I think of climate change as something that just really can't be solved without all the biggest governments working together. You need all the major, it's a problem where small actors can't be a solution by themselves. But we do see Arnold Schwarzenegger through the UN is working on this sort of subnational strategy, focusing on cities. Can that really be effective, and how?
Well, I think this is not an area of my expertise, but I think it definitely can. I think a number of cities and local governments are taking steps to curb emissions and to take steps to further, responses to climate change. And I think that, again, that's really exciting. I mean, there probably needs to be a national response in most countries, but I think that the local response can sometimes urge a national response and be the engine for change in a country. So I think it's positive, and how you kind of organize that for an ultimate national response, I'm not quite sure of. But I think what we're seeing is that local authorities, local citizens don't want to wait for a national response on things like climate change.
A question for you and for Kristen, well, for all three of you. You talked about the youth boom. And Sherry, you talked about the need to increase women's representation in government abroad. How does the U.S. engage in that? And this is for all three of you. How does the U.S., if you have this huge population of young people, and if you're looking at other governments and you say we want to increase women's involvement in representative politics, how can the U.S. keep the youth boom from becoming a bad boom? What are sort of some of the specifics that the U.S. government could do on that?
Well, I'll take a stab at I think a lot of it's done through our development efforts at USAID and the State Department. But like Kristen pointed out, these are areas that are really underfunded and that do not get the kind of attention that I think in this world today, where there's so much going on, there's so many priorities and there's so many budget priorities, women and youth sort of fall to the bottom of the barrel. And I think it requires groups like the Women's Foreign Policy Group and other advocacy organizations to keep reminding our elected leaders and our administration that both of these somewhat marginalized groups can be engines for economic growth. They can pull people out of poverty, but there needs to be attention, there needs to be more funding. But certainly organizations like NDI and Kristen's organization IREX do work directly with women and youth around the world, but I don't think it's enough. I think it's insufficient at this point.
Another question on youth. How do we cope with youth unemployment globally? Isn't it critical, particularly in the Middle East? Again, as you look at sort of this tension between, is this going to be an opportunity or is it going to be a driver of conflict? How do you get at youth unemployment?
So can I start to answer
the
last
of course.
question?
Sorry.
No, that's all right. It's just I had the answer all formulated, and then there was a new question. So on this issue, I think there are 2 points I wanted to make. The first is that, of course, it can't just be governments that deal with either the unemployment issue or women's empowerment or youth empowerment. It has to also be private organizations, nonprofit organizations, civil society organizations as well. And on the job front in particular, governments creating jobs is not a winning strategy. Governments are not good at this. And so I think what governments can do is to try and set conditions that help the private sector to create opportunities. So that's my answer to that question. And on the issue of how to empower women, IREX is actually working with USAID on something that's, I think, quite interesting and innovative. It's a program called Takamal in Jordan. USAID considers it its flagship women's gender empowerment program in the Middle East. And why it's considered unusual is because it doesn't treat women as being a separate thing over in the corner that no one pays attention to. Instead, the goal of the initiative is to look across the range of foreign assistance programs in Jordan, and that's the second largest USAID mission in the world, I believe, so that's a lot of money and programming. And to make sure that all of those programs, whether it's an employment program, a municipal governance program, a health program, all have a gender component to them. So you stop thinking about women as being way over here in the corner as its own little siloed issue, and youth would be the same, I'd say, and start thinking about, well, we have all of these programs or activities that cut across the society and the economy. How do we make sure that all are included?
A question on conflict, and a couple of questions from the audience repeating this theme. What alternative models that use non-military means? What are good alternative models that use non-military means to address conflicts, possibly at root causes? Models exist for managing conflict without violence. How do you get at managing conflict without putting boots on the ground?
I mean, I'll take a first stab at it because I think there are a lot of different models that have been tried. I think this question of especially conflict prevention and preventive diplomacy in advance of conflict actually unfolding it has been one that the international community has grappled with and not fully successfully over the years. I think in some ways it's kind of one of those things that it's, people can stand up and, jump up and down and shout about it's coming, but until it actually comes, then, we have the tools that we know, send in a peacekeeping mission. And in fact, if you just look at some of the decisions that the Security Council has made in recent years around sending peacekeeping missions into conflicts in Africa, I think we could clearly see sort of that trajectory and that sequencing, that there was some warning about what was going on. That we didn't necessarily have the right fit of tools or the political will to employ and deploy those tools effectively in advance, that then we saw conflict break out, and that then all too often I think we've had a bit more than we should have of a cookie-cutter approach to how we respond to those crises. And in fact, that's one of the things that we are focusing a lot on now in our role as Security Council members, and certainly inside the State Department and more broadly in the US government as we look at these questions. I just met yesterday with the guy who is the UN Special Representative to the Central African region. And his job is actually over, I think, 8 countries to look across to see where there are possible trigger points for conflict breaking out or civil unrest, for example, if an election is coming up that is worrisome in terms of how that might go down. And to bring that information back to the Security Council, to bring it to the states in question, to bring it to the broader UN system, and himself to deploy a form of preventive diplomacy with his team to try to work with the parties and the actors on the ground to avoid the conflict breaking out. So we are seeing more use of the so-called special political missions, for example, in the UN system, which very much do seek to go in and play this role of trying to moderate among parties, trying to in some cases, create national dialogues where they're needed to keep transitions on track to avoid conflict breaking out. But then when you look at the peacekeeping side, I think what you also see is missions that are filled with everything from, getting back to Kristen's point, gender advisors these days, to civilian police, to a lot of civilian aspects in the peacekeeping missions, not only boots on the ground. So you're seeing some change in terms of attempting not to just sort of cookie cutter, okay, we need a bunch of sort of army guys to go out there and sit and try to deflect this conflict or keep the warring parties away from each other. But in fact, what tools do we actually need to address this specific situation, and making the Security Council come back more often and review the ongoing conflicts that it has on its agenda to see whether that mix of tools needs to be changed in any way.
So I'd start at first principles and say that as long as there are humans on the planet, it's not possible to have a world without conflict. That said, it is possible to have a world where conflicts are not conducted through violence. There are effective methods of resolving conflicts without violence, and in fact, we do it all day, every day in many parts of the world. The question is, how can we spread these tools? How can we make this more prevalent than it is now? And then, you could write a book on this, but I'll give the quickest answer possible. There's no magic silver bullet, but you have to work at a lot of levels at once. The first is there has to be security. And we tend to focus on the military, but actually peacekeeping forces and even more so in some ways police forces are just as important, and security is a basic ingredient for peace. But another set of issues that are really neglected in relative terms when you look at our foreign affairs budget is justice and governance mechanisms. Because after all, what is the primary way of resolving conflicts without violence? It's government and justice systems. That's where a lot of that happens. So that's another very important piece of the pie. And then the last one I'll call attention to are the more societal level issues. You know, how do you reduce intergroup tension, intergroup violence, stereotypes and exclusion, social exclusion that leads to conflicts? A lot of that has to happen at the community level, through the media, through mediation, and there are a different set of tools usually involving civil society that you can use to work on that. But really, if you don't have all of these things working together, it's hard to be effective.
Another theme that I see emerging is the theme of economic inequality. We're hearing now about that as a huge issue we're focusing on in the U.S., sort of the hollowing out of the U.S. middle class and greater separation between the richest and the poorest. And we're seeing that, it seems that we're seeing that force taking place across the globe as well. What role can the U.S. play? I mean, it also seems like this is more of a driver of violence and conflict as well around the world. Can the U.S. play a role in alleviating economic inequality around the world, in trying to create middle classes where they're even more unstable than they are here?
I'll take a stab at that. We recently talked about an article that came out last year that looked at the 800 protests that have occurred around the world since 2005. And there's been an assumption, I think, by many that a lot of the protests, civic protests that's been going on, are related to economic inequality. In fact, this academic data and report showed that the majority of those protests were a result of feeling a sense of lack of dignity and respect by government. And people may be, in fact, economically disadvantaged, but what was more of a challenge for them and what was actually taking them to the street was the type of government and the respect, or the way that government was engaging with citizens. And I think we need to keep an eye on that. There's only, I think, so much that the United States can do to solve economic challenges around the world, but there's more that we can do to try to influence good governance in many parts of the world. And as it connects also to conflict, I think as we see these protests and challenges around the world pointing to bad governance and poor representation that could eventually lead to conflict, that's when we can step in and try to do something.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to pick up on that, I think it's a prime example of a place where there's not necessarily all that much that the U.S. government can do on its own, and just to sort of point back to the fact that the international community is currently negotiating the follow-on to the Millennium Development Goals that very much try to get at this issue of poverty alleviation, income inequality, and I think very importantly and differently from the MDGs actually do also include, will include a goal on peace and governance. And so, speaking very directly to this link that we see between the economic situations on the one hand and then peace and governance issues, and taking that on as a global community to try to really get at some of these problems, because it's certainly not one that the U.S. can sort of go out around the world and try to address on its own.
I'd say that this issue of political, social, and economic inclusion could prove to be the defining issue of our time. And it's an issue for the United States. We saw this up the road in Baltimore. It's also an issue in countries like Tunisia, and it's an issue in poor countries like the DRC. And how we grapple with this is going to define whether we have a peace opportunity going forward. I'm less worried about inequality per se and more worried about whether people have opportunity. Are people trapped in certain classes, economic strata, where they can't get out? Are they politically marginalized and there isn't an option for them? I think working on that is a big issue. I think one thing the US government can deal with is corruption. Score one for anti-corruption with the FIFA work. Well, thank you. Well done, U.S. on that. But corruption is one of those things that does just sap the sense of opportunity and justice out of a society. It creates huge grievances and economic inequality, and that's something that the United States, because of its economic power and its role in the international banking system, really can play an important role.
We're running out of time, so we have time just for one last question. This question is for everyone. What professional development advice would you give to a young professional to tackle these new global challenges as a future leader?
All right, well, I'll start with my stock answer on career development advice, which is don't worry too much about having a 1-year plan, and don't worry too much about having a 5-year plan or even a 10-year plan. I never have, and somehow I've ended up in this job that is actually really the perfect place for me to be right now. But I think underlying that, on my part anyway, has been an openness to have a lot of different kinds of experiences and not necessarily be wedded to any one path, and certainly, getting back to the theme of opportunity, to be open to seizing opportunities when they come your way or when you hear about them, so that even if you are somebody who likes to have a 5-year plan, be willing to break out of that plan, because I think it can only, and the breadth of issues that have been raised and discussed on the panel today, I think just reaffirm the fact that it can only be helpful both to your own career development, but also to advancing progress on these issues, to have seen how these issues arise and how they are tackled from a lot of different vantage points.
I'll go with some do's and don'ts, maybe more than the do. Do what Shiva said. I also have never had a career plan, or even if I had, it would have been tossed out the window at least 5 or 6 major occasions. So Shiva's giving good advice. Another do is take the initiative. Personally, many of the jobs I've had in my career didn't exist before I held them, or one other person had them and I completely redefined it. There are many more opportunities for people to create their own job based on a need they see in an organization than I think especially young people think. The last don't and do is don't go for jobs only because of the name of the organization. I see a lot of people who want to work for organizations because they see what to them is a brand, they see a big name, but the fact of the matter is, especially for young people, there are way more opportunities to learn and to grow and to be next to the boss and see what they're dealing with in small organizations and fast-growing organizations than these big, highly established, more hierarchical organizations. And I just consistently see people turn away from those opportunities where there are actually more opportunities and to the brand name because they're focused on that. And so if you focus on what you're going to be doing, where the organization is going, and what your role can be, and most importantly, who you are going to work for and with, this is by far, in my opinion, much more important than whatever marquee name is on your resume.
I agree with everything that was said. I would, if you're interested in foreign affairs, foreign policy, international, anything, I would encourage you to be curious and very much encourage you to try to live and work abroad. I think this city is filled with a tremendous amount of highly educated and talented people in this field, but many of them have never really experienced professionally or personally working or living overseas, and it will change your life. And I think change the way that you are as a professional. I would also encourage you to network, and I think that sometimes has a negative connotation. I think it's really just try to be social and nice and outgoing. There's so many opportunities in this city and around the world if you just sort of reach out and talk to folks. And I think many of us have found our jobs or our next career moves because we've had relationships where we never expected a job out of it, but it led to a discussion or an interview or something. So go overseas if you have the chance. Do it while you're young, because it's harder to do the older you get, and network and be sociable.
Okay, well, great. Thank you all so much. I think we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Well, what a day. Oh, simply extraordinary. We had conversations with very impressive women who are making a difference, and we networked key in the process. Some of you, I guarantee you, found your new job in this room today. You just don't know it yet. You don't. To continue our mission and make sure women's voices will be heard, Pat and I hope that you will join us as members of the Women's Foreign Policy Group and continue the conversation we started. Shortly, we'll reconvene at the Embassy of Finland for tonight's reception to celebrate our accomplishments and to toast the next generation of women leaders. Thank you, Pat, Julia, and Pauline, for having that conversation around your kitchen table. Thank you very much for being here, and we enjoyed having you.